A pit bull refuses to leave a blind baby's room, ignoring commands and watching the window every night. When the parents review the recordings, they discover something that makes them call the police immediately. The late afternoon sun filtered through the curtains of the bedroom, casting dancing shadows on the light blue walls. Sarah watched, her heart overflowing with love, as her little Ethan slept peacefully in his crib. Beside him, as always, was Duke, the family's imposing pit bull, his watchful eyes fixed on the bedroom window. Ethan's arrival had completely transformed the dynamics of their home. From the moment the baby first crossed the threshold of the house, wrapped in a yellow blanket, Duke had displayed behavior that surprised everyone. The dog, already known for his gentle and protective nature, developed an instant connection with the newborn. Sarah still vividly remembered the day she discovered her son would be born with a special condition. During the 5th-month ultrasound, the doctor had detected that the baby would not develop sight. The news had fallen like a weight on her and Michael, her husband. However, the love they felt for the child to come was greater than any challenge they might face. "Sarah, you need to see this," Michael called softly from the bedroom door, interrupting her reflections. She approached silently, trying not to wake Ethan. What she saw made her smile. Duke had brought his own blanket to the room and was meticulously arranging it next to the crib, preparing for another night of vigil. "He doesn't leave his post for anything, does he?" Sarah whispered, resting her head on her husband's shoulder. Michael hugged his wife, observing the scene with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. In recent days, Duke's behavior had become even more intense. It wasn't just protection. There seemed to be something more in his attentive eyes. The dog barely moved away from the crib to eat, and when he did, he kept his ears alert, as if picking up sounds imperceptible to humans. During the night, his behavior became even more peculiar. Duke would position himself strategically between the window and the crib, like a silent guardian. "Don't you think he's different?" Michael asked, furrowing his brow. Sarah knew exactly what he was referring to. The night before, she had tried to convince Duke to sleep in his usual bed in the living room, but the dog had vehemently refused. For the first time since they had adopted him years ago, Duke had shown resistance to a command. "He is," she replied thoughtfully. "It's as if he knows something we don't." At that moment, Ethan began to stir in the crib, his little fingers waving in the air. Duke immediately turned his head in his direction, his ears moving subtly. The baby, even unable to see, opened a radiant smile, as if he could feel the protective presence beside him. The scene would have been just another touching moment between a dog and his little human, if not for a detail that made Sarah shudder. For the first time, she noticed that Duke wasn't looking at Ethan, but at a specific point above the crib, his muscles tense under his shiny coat. The sun was beginning to set, and the shadows in the room became more pronounced. Michael turned on the main light, breaking the mysterious atmosphere that had settled in. "Shall we have dinner?" he suggested, trying to dispel the strange sensation that lingered in the air. Sarah nodded, casting one last glance at Duke before leaving the room. The dog remained motionless, his posture alerting that something beyond natural protective instinct kept him there. That night, as the couple prepared for bed, neither could shake the feeling that Duke knew something they had not yet realized. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us which city you're watching us from. We'll continue. The early hours of the morning arrived silently, enveloping the house in deep shadows. The clock in the living room showed 11:45 p.m. when Sarah woke up with a start, not knowing exactly why. Her maternal instinct drove her to check on Ethan, as she did several times during the night. As she approached the baby's room, she noticed that the door was ajar, letting out a beam of light from the nightlight they always kept on. Duke continued, in his usual position, but something in his posture made Sarah stop at the doorway. The dog was completely motionless, his eyes fixed on the window, ears raised in maximum attention. "Duke," she called softly, but the pit bull didn't move. Not even when she entered the room and approached the crib did he look away from the window. Ethan slept peacefully, his soft and rhythmic breathing filling the environment with a peace that contrasted with the obvious tension in the dog's behavior. A shiver ran down Sarah's spine when she noticed that the room temperature was lower than normal. She checked the air conditioner, but it was off. The window, as always, was closed and locked, but even so, a cold draft seemed to circulate through the room. "How strange," she murmured to herself, adjusting Ethan's blanket. It was at that moment that something extraordinary happened. The baby, still sleeping, raised his little hands in the air as if he wanted to reach something or someone. Duke immediately stood up, his fur bristling, a low and contained growl emerging from his throat. Sarah felt her heart racing. She took out her cell phone and discreetly started filming. Duke's behavior was becoming increasingly intriguing, and she wanted to show Michael, who always said she was seeing things. While filming, she noticed something she hadn't noticed before. Every time Ethan moved his hands, Duke slightly changed his position, as if he were following something that moved around the room. The low growl continued, but it wasn't threatening. It seemed more like a warning. "Sarah, what are you doing awake?" Michael's sleepy voice sounded from the door, making her jump in surprise. She signaled for him to be quiet and pointed to Duke and Ethan. Michael entered the room silently, observing the scene with growing interest. "Look at this," Sarah whispered, showing the video she was recording. "It's not the first time this has happened. Duke gets like this almost every night, always at the same time." Michael frowned, his expression changing from sleepy to concerned. "How long has this been going on?" "I started noticing it a few weeks ago," she replied, still filming. "At first I thought it was just his protective instinct, but now..." Her voice faltered as Duke suddenly moved, placing himself between the crib and the window, his posture even tenser. The clock struck midnight, and as if responding to an invisible command, Ethan opened his eyes. Even unable to see, the baby smiled and began to babble softly, his little arms still extended upwards. Duke remained on maximum alert, his eyes never leaving the window. Michael cautiously approached the window, examining the dark garden outside. The full moon's light cast strange shadows through the branches of the old tree near the house. For a moment, he thought he saw a movement, but convinced himself it was just the wind rustling the leaves. "I'm going to install security cameras tomorrow," he declared, turning to Sarah. "I don't like the way Duke is acting. Something's wrong here." Sarah nodded, feeling a weight in her stomach. As she adjusted Ethan's blanket once more, who was falling back asleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Duke maintained his silent vigil, his alert eyes reflecting the nightlight's glow, a faithful guardian of secrets that only he seemed to know. The sound of the alert made Sarah and Michael's blood run cold. They quickly grabbed their phones to check the camera images. The garden seemed peaceful at first glance, but there was a subtle movement near the bushes. "It must be just a cat," Michael said, trying to sound convincing, but his voice betrayed his concern. Sarah, holding her phone firmly, observed the images closely. That's when she noticed something strange on the screen. For a fraction of a second, one of the cameras showed a distortion, as if something had quickly passed in front of it. In the room, Duke began to stir. His behavior was different from usual. He wasn't just alert, but seemed ready to act. His muscles were tense, and a low, constant growl emanated from his throat. Ethan, who would normally be sleeping deeply at this hour, began to move in the crib. "Michael, look at this," Sarah whispered, pointing to her phone screen. The camera, focusing on Ethan's bedroom window, had captured something, an undefined shadow, that seemed to move in an unnatural way, as if floating near the house wall. The couple exchanged apprehensive looks. They could no longer deny that something extraordinary was happening. Duke, still maintaining his protective position, began to move in a circular pattern around the crib, his eyes never leaving the window. "I'm going to call the police," Michael decided. But before he could pick up the phone, something unexpected happened. All the house cameras began to show interference simultaneously. The images became distorted, with static filling the phone screens. At that moment, Ethan woke up. But unlike other nights, he wasn't smiling. His little face showed unease, and his small arms waved in the air as if trying to reach something or defend himself from something. Duke reacted immediately. The low growl transformed into a deep, authoritative bark, something they had never heard before. The Pitbull positioned himself between the crib and the window, his posture indicating he was ready to protect Ethan at any cost. Sarah ran to pick up her son, while Michael frantically checked the window locks. The air in the room had become inexplicably cold, and a heavy sensation hung in the environment. Duke continued barking, his eyes fixed on a specific point near the ceiling. It was then that something caught Sarah's attention. In the reflection of the window glass, she could see something that made her heart almost stop. A dark, undefined form moved slowly through the room, approaching the crib where Ethan had been moments before. "Michael!" she screamed, clutching the baby to her chest. Duke advanced towards the shadow, barking with even more intensity. The room temperature dropped even further, and the lights began to flicker. The security system continued sending alerts, but the images on the cameras were completely distorted. Michael, acting on instinct, grabbed his family and led them out of the room. Duke, surprisingly, didn't follow them. He remained in the room, still in a defensive position, as if facing an invisible adversary. From the hallway, they could hear Duke's barks mixed with a strange, low sound, almost like a whisper. Ethan, still in Sarah's arms, had inexplicably calmed down as if he knew he was protected. "We need to do something," Michael said, his voice trembling slightly. But before they could decide what to do, Duke's barks abruptly ceased. The silence that followed was deafening. After a few minutes that seemed like an eternity, Michael gathered the courage to slowly open the door. Duke was sitting calmly next to the empty crib, as if nothing had happened. The air was still cold, but the oppressive sensation had disappeared. "Duke," Sarah called softly, still holding Ethan close to her chest. The Pitbull turned to her, his eyes conveying a serenity that contrasted with the ferocity demonstrated moments before. He stood up calmly and approached the family, gently rubbing his head against Sarah's leg. Michael entered the room, examining every corner carefully. The cameras had returned to normal function, and the lights were no longer flickering. Everything seemed to be in order, except for one detail that made his heart race. There were scratch marks on the wall paint near the window that definitely weren't there before. "Look at this," he said, running his fingers over the marks. "How did this happen?" Duke was on the other side of the room the whole time. Sarah approached to examine the scratches, feeling a shiver run down her spine. The marks formed a strange pattern, almost as if they were symbols. Ethan, in her arms, began to stir again, extending his little hands towards the marked wall. "I'm going to check the recordings," Michael declared, picking up his phone. The images from the last few hours were saved, but something peculiar caught his attention. At the exact moment when the cameras showed interference, a sequence of frames showed an anomaly, a distortion in the air like a ripple that moved through the room. Albert, the equipment store salesman, had mentioned that the cameras had a special thermal motion detection feature. Michael activated this function and began to review the previous recordings. What he saw left him speechless. During the interference, the thermal sensors had registered an area of intense cold moving through the room, exactly where Duke had been barking. "Sarah, you need to see this," he called, but before he could show her the images, Sarah's phone vibrated with a notification. It was a message from their neighbor, Helen. "Sarah, is everything okay over there? I heard very loud barking and saw strange lights coming from your house. Did something happen?" As Sarah responded to the message, trying to downplay the situation, Michael continued analyzing the recordings. That's when he noticed something that had gone unnoticed. In the moments preceding the interference, a shadowy figure could be seen outside the window, partially hidden by the bushes. "This isn't possible," he murmured, zooming in on the image. The figure was tall and slender, but its features were impossible to distinguish. Most disturbing was that, frame by frame, it seemed to be approaching the window, but its movements were different from anything Michael had ever seen. Duke, who had remained calm until then, suddenly pricked up his ears and fixed his gaze on the window again. His fur began to bristle, but this time there were no barks. It was as if he were just alerting, "I'm watching. Don't dare come back." Sarah put Ethan back in the crib, noticing that the baby seemed strangely calm. His little fingers played with the air, as if he could see something that the adults couldn't perceive. Duke immediately resumed his protective position next to the crib, but his posture was different, more confident, as if he had established his territory. "We need to understand what's happening," Sarah said, her voice heavy with concern. "This isn't normal. Duke's behavior, the cameras, the marks on the wall, something very strange is happening here." Michael nodded, still analyzing the images on his phone. "I'm going to contact a security expert tomorrow. Maybe he can help us understand these recordings better." What they didn't know was that the marks on the wall were just the beginning. Duke had sensed something that night, something that made him intensify his vigilance even more. His protective instinct was sharper than ever, as if he knew that this wouldn't be the last time he would need to defend his little charge. The following morning brought with it an apparent normalcy, but tension still lingered in the air. Michael had spent the night awake, alternating between watching the cameras and researching on the internet about inexplicable phenomena captured by security systems. Sarah, for her part, couldn't get out of her head the image of the shadow she had seen in the window's reflection. During breakfast, the doorbell rang. It was Helen, the neighbor, who had come to express her concern about the events of the previous night in person. Duke, who normally greeted visitors with joy, remained by Ethan's crib, completely ignoring the neighbor's presence. "You won't believe this," Helen began, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. "But it's not the first time I've seen strange things happening in this neighborhood. Mrs. Anderson, who lived in this house before you, also reported unexplainable events." Sarah and Michael exchanged significant looks. It was the first time they had heard anything about the house's former occupant. "What kind of events?" Michael asked, trying to maintain a casual tone. "Well, she said her cat, Whiskers, had behaviors very similar to what you described about Duke," Helen explained. "He was always alert at specific times, especially at night. And then there were the marks." "Marks?" Sarah interrupted, her heart racing. "What kind of marks?" Helen hesitated for a moment, as if choosing her words. "Scratches on the walls, always near the windows. Mrs. Anderson even called in several experts, but no one could explain how they appeared." At that moment, a cry from Ethan echoed through the house. Before Sarah could get up, Duke was already barking, drawing everyone's attention. When they reached the room, they found an intriguing scene. Ethan was smiling, his little hands extended upwards, while Duke maintained a protective posture, but without showing aggression. "Does this happen often?" Helen asked, observing the scene with curiosity. "More and more frequently," Sarah replied, picking Ethan up. "It's as if he could see something that we can't." Helen remained silent for a few moments, her face assuming a thoughtful expression. "Have you ever heard about children with special sensitivity, especially those born with some physical limitation?" Michael, who had been absorbed in the camera images on his phone, raised his head with interest. "What do you mean?" "My grandmother used to say that some children, especially those who can't see with their eyes, develop a kind of different vision," Helen explained, "as if they could perceive things that are beyond our normal understanding." As Helen spoke, Duke approached Ethan, gently rubbing his head against Sarah's legs. The baby let out a joyful laugh, his fingers seeking the dog's soft fur. It was a touching scene, but there was something more there, a connection that went beyond the simple affection between an animal and a child. "There's one more thing," Helen continued, her voice lowering to almost a whisper. "Mrs. Anderson left this house not just because of the strange events. She said there was something watching, something that seemed especially interested in children. That's why she installed so many protection amulets before she left." "Amulets?" Sarah asked, adjusting Ethan in her arms. "Yes, small protection. Symbols," Helen replied. "In fact—" She stopped abruptly, her eyes fixed on the wall where the scratches had appeared the night before. "Those marks, they're very similar to the symbols Mrs. Anderson used to draw." Michael approached the wall, examining the marks more closely. In the daylight, they really seemed to form a specific pattern, something that didn't seem random or accidental. Duke, observing the scene, remained alert, his eyes alternating between the wall and the window. What had begun as a series of inexplicable events was turning into something much bigger. The coincidences were too many to be ignored, and Helen's revelations only confirmed that there was more to this story than they had imagined. Duke wasn't just protecting Ethan. He was facing something that had been there before, something that had a special interest in special children like his little charge. After the revealing conversation with Helen, Michael decided to investigate more about the house's history. A quick internet search led him to the local newspaper archives, where he found some old reports about the area. What he discovered made his heart race. In the last 30 years, several families with young children had suddenly moved away from that neighborhood. "Sarah, look at this," he called, showing the laptop to his wife. All these families had something in common: children with some kind of special sensitivity, visual impairment, hearing impairment, or other unique gifts. Sarah, who was cradling Ethan in her arms, felt a shiver run down her spine. "And did they all have pets?" she asked, observing Duke, who maintained his constant vigil near them. "According to the reports, yes," Michael replied, continuing his reading. "And in all cases, the animals demonstrated intense protective behaviors, especially during the night." As they talked, Duke suddenly raised his head, his ears moving in alert. Ethan, who was almost asleep, opened his eyes and began to smile, extending his little hands to the air as they had witnessed before. But this time something different happened. The tablet that was on the table began to show interference, its screen flashing without any command. When Michael picked it up, he noticed that the device's camera was activated, automatically capturing images. In the photos that appeared, strange luminous spots could be seen floating around Ethan. "This isn't a reflection," Sarah murmured, leaning in to see the images better. "Look how they move in a coordinated way, as if they were interacting." With him, Duke positioned himself strategically between the family and the living room window, his behavior calm but vigilant. It was as if he already knew that presence, as if he had established a silent agreement with whatever was there. At that moment, the doorbell rang again. It was Albert, the security equipment store salesman, carrying an old and dusty folder. "Sorry for showing up without warning," he said as he was invited in, "but after our conversation yesterday, I needed to show you something. These are photos and documents that Mrs. Anderson left with me before she moved, seated at the kitchen table." Albert opened the folder, revealing dozens of old photographs and handwritten notes. The images showed light patterns similar to those they had just captured on the tablet, as well as detailed drawings of the symbols that now marked Ethan's bedroom wall. "Mrs. Anderson wasn't just an ordinary resident," Albert explained, his voice heavy with seriousness. "She was a scholar of paranormal phenomena, especially those related to children with special gifts. According to her research, there are entities that are attracted to these children." "Entities?" Michael questioned, skeptically. "Yes, but not in the way you might be imagining," Albert continued. "She described them as protective presences, invisible guardians that are attracted by the purity and unique sensitivity of these children. The problem is that where there is light, darkness also tries to manifest." Sarah instinctively hugged Ethan closer to her chest, while Duke moved even closer, as if he understood every word of the conversation. "Animals," Albert went on, "especially dogs like Duke, have the ability to distinguish between these presences. They know which ones are protective and which ones have other intentions. The marks on the wall aren't symbols of threat. They're protection marks, like an invisible boundary that Duke is helping to maintain." Albert's words seemed to make sense of everything they had been experiencing: Duke's behavior, Ethan's reactions, the mysterious lights, even the interference in electronic equipment. It wasn't an evil presence that Duke was fighting. He was helping to protect a delicate balance between two worlds. Albert continued revealing Mrs. Anderson's discoveries, each page of her notes bringing more clarity to the mystery surrounding the house. The photographs showed a sequence of documented events over the years, all connected by a similar pattern: special children, protective animals, and inexplicable manifestations. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a specific photo. This was taken exactly 20 years ago, in the room that is now Ethan's. The child in the photo was also blind, and the family dog exhibited the same behavior as Duke. In the image, spots of light danced around a smiling child, while a German shepherd maintained a vigilant posture by their side. Most impressive were the symbols on the wall, identical to those that had recently appeared in Ethan's room. According to Mrs. Anderson's notes, Albert continued, there's a cycle. Each time a special child comes to live here, the protective presences manifest. But they're not the only ones attracted by this energy. Duke, who had been quiet until then, began to sniff the air more intensely. Ethan, in Sarah's arms, let out a soft giggle, his fingers moving as if touching something invisible. The symbols on the walls, Albert explained, are a kind of barrier, a boundary between our world and another plane of existence. Animals, like Duke, function as guardians of this boundary. They can see and interact with both sides. Michael, who had always been skeptical about supernatural matters, found himself increasingly intrigued. The evidence was hard to ignore, especially with the new photographs captured on his tablet, showing patterns so similar to those recorded 2 decades ago. But why now? Sarah questioned, adjusting Ethan in her arms. Why are these manifestations becoming more intense? Albert flipped through a few more pages of notes before answering. Mrs. Anderson believed that there are specific moments, like temporal portals, when the boundary between worlds becomes thinner. According to her research, we're entering one of these periods. At that moment, all the lights in the house began to flicker softly. Duke stood up, but not aggressively. His behavior was more like someone recognizing the arrival of a familiar visitor. "Look!" Sarah exclaimed, pointing to the tablet still on the table. The screen showed a sequence of images being captured automatically. In the photos, luminous orbs of different colors danced around them, concentrating especially near Ethan. "They're the guardians," Albert murmured, his voice filled with admiration. "They're revealing themselves to us." Duke approached Ethan, gently touching the baby with his nose. The little one laughed, his hands seeking the dog's soft fur. The lights around them seemed to react to this interaction, creating even more complex and beautiful patterns. "Mrs. Anderson left a specific warning," Albert continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "During these periods of increased activity, it's crucial to maintain balance. Duke isn't just protecting Ethan from something bad, he's helping to manage the flow of energy between the two worlds." Sarah and Michael watched, fascinated, as the lights continued their silent dance around them. Duke maintained his protective position, but now it was evident that his function went far beyond simple guarding. He was a mediator between worlds, a guardian of the twilight that separated the visible from the invisible. "What should we do?" Michael asked, finally accepting the extraordinary reality that presented itself before them. "Trust Duke," Albert replied simply. "He knows exactly what needs to be done. Animals have an ancestral wisdom about these things that we humans have long forgotten." The following morning, dark clouds gathered in the sky, heralding a strong storm. Michael had spent the night organizing all the information collected: Mrs. Anderson's notes, the old and recent photos, and the security camera records. Each piece of the puzzle seemed to fit perfectly, revealing a pattern that went beyond his previous understanding. "I found something interesting," he said to Sarah, who was preparing breakfast while Duke maintained his constant vigilance near Ethan's crib. In Mrs. Anderson's notes, she mentions that the most intense manifestations always happen during storms. As if responding to his words, a distant thunder echoed, making the house windows vibrate softly. Duke immediately raised his head, his ears moving in alert, but his behavior was different from usual. Instead of showing concern, he seemed to be expecting something. "There's one more thing," Michael continued, flipping through the old notebook. "Mrs. Anderson discovered that there are specific cycles for these manifestations, and according to her notes, we're entering the peak of one of these cycles exactly today." Sarah approached to get a better look at the notes when she noticed something peculiar through the kitchen window. In the garden, small spheres of light began to form, even though it was still morning. They were different from the nocturnal manifestations. These had more intense colors and seemed to move in a more determined way. "Michael, look," she called, pointing to the phenomenon. Duke calmly stood up and headed to the back door, as if asking to go out. When Sarah opened the door, he walked decisively to the center of the garden, where the lights were concentrating. What happened next left them both speechless. The luminous spheres began to circle around Duke, creating complex patterns in the air. The Pitbull remained motionless, his posture noble and serene, as if participating in an ancient ritual. In the crib, Ethan began to wave his little arms and smile, as if he could see the spectacle through his special eyes. "The symbols," Michael murmured, observing the lights. "They're reproducing the same patterns as the marks on the wall. Indeed, the luminous spheres were drawing in the air forms identical to the symbols that had mysteriously appeared in Ethan's room. It was as if they were witnessing the origin of those marks, an ancient knowledge being transmitted through manifestations of pure energy. Albert had mentioned that Duke was more than a simple protector. He was a mediator between worlds. Now observing that extraordinary scene, they began to truly understand the meaning of those words. The Pitbull wasn't just guarding Ethan from invisible threats. He was actively participating in a cosmic balance that transcended human comprehension. The storm approached rapidly, and with it, the manifestations intensified. The security cameras began to capture increasingly impressive images. Waves of multicolored energy emanating from the garden and enveloping the entire house like a protective force field. "According to the notes," Michael said, his voice barely containing the excitement, "this is just the beginning. Mrs. Anderson mentions that during the peak of the cycle, the barriers between worlds become so thin that it's possible—" He couldn't finish the sentence. A lightning bolt cut across the sky, illuminating the garden with an intense flash. When the light dissipated, something had changed. The luminous spheres now formed a kind of ethereal portal, and through it, diffuse shadows began to materialize. Duke remained at his post, calm and vigilant, as if this was exactly what he had been waiting for. Ethan, in his crib, let out a crystalline laugh that echoed through the environment. His little hands extended towards the phenomenon unfolding in the garden. Sarah and Michael watched, mesmerized, as the storm approached, and the world they knew began to intertwine with something far beyond their comprehension. Duke wasn't just a guardian, he was a bridge between realities, and that storm was about to reveal secrets that would forever transform their understanding of the true nature of reality. The storm finally arrived with all its force, but the rain that fell seemed to magically divert from the circle of light that had formed in the garden. Duke remained at the center of that extraordinary phenomenon, his imposing figure serving as a beacon between two worlds. The shadows that had begun to materialize now took on more defined forms. "I can't believe what I'm seeing," Sarah whispered, holding Ethan close to her chest. The baby was extraordinarily calm, as if this surreal situation was perfectly natural for him. Through the ethereal portal, luminous forms began to emerge. They were no longer just spheres of light. They were silhouettes that vaguely resembled human forms, but composed entirely of pure energy. Their colors changed constantly, creating a hypnotic spectacle of light and movement. Michael, who had run to get the professional camera he kept in his office, began to photograph frantically. Each click of the shutter captured a different aspect of the phenomenon. Some images showed the entities clearly, while in others they appeared only as trails of light. "Mrs. Anderson's notes," he said between clicks, mention that these beings are the true guardians. Duke isn't just protecting Ethan, he's facilitating communication between our world and theirs. As if confirming his words, one of the luminous entities approached Duke, gently touching his head with what appeared to be a hand made of pure light. The Pitbull closed his eyes, completely serene, while waves of multicolored energy emanated from the point of contact. Ethan began to stir, in Sarah's arms, extending his little hands towards the entities. His face lit up with a smile of pure joy, as if he could finally see those with whom he had always interacted without his parents knowing. "He can see them," Sarah murmured, amazed. "He always could." One of the entities turned to them and, although it had no distinguishable face, it conveyed a sense of recognition and affection. It floated gently in their direction, stopping a few meters away. The air around it vibrated with an energy that made the hairs on their arms stand up. Duke observed everything with a tranquility that contrasted with his usual protective behavior. It was as if he knew this moment would come, that his role was not just to defend, But to facilitate this extraordinary encounter, suddenly something even more impressive happened. The entities began to move in a synchronized pattern, creating a dance of light and energy that seemed to tell a story. Through their movements, images formed in the air. Special children throughout. The centuries, each with their animal guardian, each part of an ancient lineage of connections between worlds. "That's why they chose Ethan," Michael said, lowering the camera, his voice choked with emotion. "It's not just because of his special condition, it's because he can see beyond the veil that separates our worlds." The storm continued to rage around them, but inside the circle of light reigned absolute peace. The entities continued their cosmic dance, revealing through their luminous manifestations secrets that had been hidden for generations. Duke moved for the first time since the beginning of the phenomenon, calmly walking to Ethan and Sarah. The entities opened the way for him, as if recognizing his authority in that space between worlds. When he reached them, he sat majestically, his gaze conveying an ancient wisdom. It was then that Sarah understood. Duke hadn't just been a gift of fate for their family. He had been chosen, just like Ethan, to be part of something much greater, something that transcended common understanding and connected different realities through the power of love and unconditional protection. The storm began to gradually diminish, but the light show in the garden maintained its intensity. The luminous entities continued their celestial dance, now moving in a pattern that seemed more focused and intentional. Michael noticed that they formed a kind of circle around Duke and his family. "Look!" Sarah exclaimed, pointing to the tablet that was still recording everything. The captured images showed something extraordinary. Small beams of light were emanating from Ethan and connecting with the entities, forming a delicate web of multicolored energy. Albert, who had been called urgently to witness the phenomenon, arrived breathless in the garden. His eyes widened as he witnessed the scene. "It's exactly as Mrs. Anderson described in her last notes," he said, pulling a yellowed envelope from his pocket. She predicted this would happen. As the entities continued their hypnotic dance, Albert opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a letter, handwritten in elegant calligraphy. "To those who witnessed the great encounter, if you are reading this, it means the predictions have been confirmed, the cycle completes itself again, and the guardians have chosen to reveal themselves. The special child in your home was not chosen by chance. They are part of an ancient lineage of bridges between worlds. The animals that protect these special children are not mere earthly guardians. They are reincarnated elders, chosen to guide and protect those who can see beyond the veil of common reality. Duke is not just a dog, he is an ancestral guardian who chose to return in physical form to fulfill his sacred mission." Sarah looked at Duke with new eyes. The Pitbull remained serene, his presence emanating a dignity that now seemed to make even more sense. Ethan, in her arms, let out a joyful giggle as if confirming every word of the letter. "There's more," Albert continued, turning the page. "According to Mrs. Anderson, the great encounter is just the beginning. The guardians don't reveal themselves just to put on a light show, they come with a purpose." At that moment, the luminous entities began to move differently. Their movements created patterns in the air that transformed into three-dimensional symbols, floating like living holograms. Duke stood up and walked to the center of the circle where the symbols converged. "The symbols," Michael murmured, photographing frantically. "They're the same ones that appeared on the walls, but now." "Now we can see their true meaning," Albert completed, consulting the notes. "Each symbol represents a key, a connection between our world and theirs, and Duke. Duke is the guardian of these keys." One of the brightest entities approached Ethan, extending what appeared to be a hand made of pure light. The baby raised his little arms in response, and at the moment his fingers touched the light, something extraordinary happened. Waves of colored energy emanated from the point of contact, enveloping the entire house in a soft, protective glow. "It's a blessing," Albert explained, his voice choked with emotion. "The guardians are strengthening the connection between Ethan and Duke, creating a bond that transcends the physical." The entities began to spin more rapidly, their forms merging into a kaleidoscope of colors and light. Duke remained at the center, his majestic figure serving as an anchor point between the two worlds. His fur shone with its own light, as if his true nature as an ancestral guardian was finally revealing itself completely. Sarah held Ethan with tears in her eyes, finally comprehending the magnitude of what she was witnessing. Her son wasn't just a special child. He was part of something much greater, an ancient tradition of bridges between realities. And Duke, his faithful protector, was much more than he appeared. He was an ancestral being who had chosen to return in canine form to fulfill his sacred mission of protection and guidance. The light spectacle reached its apex as the entities began to merge into a single luminous form, creating a column of pure energy that extended from the garden to the clouds. At the center of this extraordinary manifestation, Duke remained impassive, his eyes now shining with an inner light that revealed his true nature. Mrs. Anderson's letter continued in Albert's hands, who now read with a trembling voice the final revelations. The moment of the great encounter is not just a demonstration of power or a simple meeting between worlds. It is an initiation ritual, where the chosen child receives the formal blessing of the guardians. This blessing will strengthen their natural ability to perceive beyond the veil of common reality, allowing them to grow in harmony with their special gifts. As Albert read, the column of light began to pulse in a rhythm that resembled a beating heart. Waves of colored energy spread in all directions, and each time they touched Ethan, the baby smiled and waved his hands as if playing with something tangible. "Look," Sarah exclaimed, pointing to the sky. The storm clouds had opened in a perfect circle above them, revealing a starry sky impossible for that time of day. The stars seemed to pulse in the same rhythm as the column of light, creating a visual connection between sky and earth. Michael, who continued photographing everything, noticed something extraordinary in his images. Each photo showed different layers of reality. In some, the entities appeared as stylized human forms. In others, they were pure manifestations of energy. And in some, they seemed to have forms that defied human comprehension. "Mrs. Anderson explains this too," said Albert, consulting the notes once again. "The guardians can manifest in different forms depending on the perception capacity of who observes them. Ethan, in his purity and with his special vision, sees them in their truest form." Duke began to move for the first time since the beginning of the ritual. With deliberate steps, he traced a path from the center of the circle to where Sarah held Ethan. Each of his steps left a luminous mark on the ground, forming a new set of symbols that intertwined with those already floating in the air. "It's time," Albert whispered, his eyes fixed on the scene. "The ancestral guardian is about to seal the bond." Duke sat before Sarah and Ethan, his posture nobler than ever. His eyes, now completely luminous, fixed on Ethan with an intensity that conveyed centuries of wisdom and protection. The baby extended his little hands, gently touching the Pitbull's muzzle. At the moment of touch, a wave of golden energy emanated from the two, expanding in concentric circles through the garden. The symbols floating in the air began to spin more rapidly, converging to the point where Duke and Ethan connected. "What's happening?" Michael asked, amazed. "It's the dance of worlds," Albert explained, consulting the notes one last time. "The moment when the barriers between realities become thinner, allowing the guardian's blessing to fully manifest." The column of light began to concentrate, its beams converging to where Duke and Ethan connected. It was as if all the power and wisdom of the guardians were being channeled through the bond between the Pitbull and the baby. Sarah could feel the energy flowing through her son. It wasn't something scary or dangerous, but a sensation of absolute love and protection. It was as if the entire universe was conspiring to ensure that Ethan would grow up protected and in harmony with his special gifts. Duke remained firm in his position, his body now emanating a golden light that merged with the energy of the guardians. He was no longer just a dog. He was the physical manifestation of an ancestral force of protection and guidance, chosen to accompany Ethan on his unique journey. The golden energy enveloping Duke and Ethan began to stabilize, creating a field of soft, constant light around them. The luminous entities, which had merged into the column of light, now began to separate again, but in a different way. Each of them seemed to carry a part of the energy that had been channeled during the ritual. "Look at the sky," Michael exclaimed, pointing upwards. The circle in the clouds had transformed into an impossible aurora borealis, with colors that danced and intertwined in patterns reminiscent of the protection symbols. It was as if the sky itself was celebrating the sacred moment that had just occurred. Albert continued to read the last pages of Mrs. Anderson's notes, his voice trembling with the emotion of the moment. When the bond is sealed, the guardian and the child become one. Not just in the physical sense of protection, but on a much deeper level. The guardian becomes capable of perceiving not only the presences that surround us, but also the deepest needs of the child under their protection. As if confirming these words, Duke moved gently, positioning himself so that his body created a protective barrier around Ethan and Sarah. His fur still shone with that inner golden light, but now it was possible to see subtle patterns moving under his skin, as if the protection symbols themselves had become part of his being. Ethan let out a crystalline laugh, his little hands still extended towards Duke. Each time his fingers touched the Pitbull's luminous fur, small waves of energy spread through the air, creating ripples of light that expanded like waves on a lake. "Mrs. Anderson mentioned something very important here," Albert continued, adjusting his glasses to read better. "The bond established during the Great Encounter is not just a mystical connection. It's a promise, a commitment that transcends lives and realities." The luminous entities began to move in a new pattern, creating a kind of silent choreography around the family. Each of their movements seemed to tell a story, revealing through gestures and lights the ancestral secrets that had been guarded for generations. "It's incredible," Sarah murmured, observing the forms of light dancing around her. "It's as if I could feel every emotion, every moment." Michael, who had lowered the camera for an instant, noticed something extraordinary. The photos he had taken were changing by themselves on his display. The images seemed to come to life, showing not just the captured moment, but also the layers of energy and emotion that permeated each instant. "The photographs," Albert explained, consulting the notes, "are more than simple records. According to Mrs. Anderson, they become memory portals, capable of capturing not just light, but also the essence of sacred moments." Duke moved again, this time approaching even closer to Ethan. His eyes, still shining with that inner light, fixed on the babies with an intensity that conveyed centuries of wisdom and unconditional love. It was as if, at that moment, all the previous lives of the ancestral guardian were present, reaffirming his eternal commitment of protection. The luminous entities began to approach one by one, each of them gently touching Duke and Ethan before, dissolving into particles of light that were absorbed by the energy field surrounding them. It was as if they were leaving a part of themselves, further strengthening the bond that had been established. "What's happening now?" Michael asked, marveling at the scene. "It's the final blessing," Albert replied, his voice filled with reverence. "Each guardian is leaving a part of their essence, creating additional layers of protection and wisdom that will accompany Ethan and Duke on their journey together." The entire garden seemed to pulse with its own life, each plant, each leaf reflecting the sacred light emanating from the center of the ritual. The night had transformed into a moment out of time, where the barriers between worlds dissolved in a dance of light and unconditional love. The first rays of sun began to infiltrate through the circle in the sky, blending with the ethereal lights still dancing in the garden. The ritual was coming to an end, but its impact would be eternal. Duke, still emanating that soft golden light, remained close to Ethan with a presence that now carried a new dimension of meaning. Albert, finishing reading the last pages of Mrs. Anderson's notes, shared a final revelation. The dawn after the Great Encounter marks not an end, but a new beginning. The chosen child and their guardian begin a unique journey, where each day brings new discoveries about the wonders that exist beyond the veil of common reality. The luminous entities, which had shared their essence during the ritual, now began a last dance. Their movements created patterns that intertwined with the first sun rays, transforming the garden into a kaleidoscope of natural and supernatural colors. Sarah watched, emotional, as Ethan interacted with the lights surrounding him. Her son, who couldn't see the world in the conventional way, was connected to a much deeper and more meaningful reality than she could have ever imagined. The most extraordinary thing, Albert said, carefully storing the notes, is that this is just the beginning. Mrs. Anderson mentions that each chosen child develops a unique form of interaction with the guardians, guided by the ancestral wisdom of their protector. Duke moved gently, positioning himself so that the first rays of the sun created a golden halo around him. His fur still maintained that inner glow, but now it was possible to see that the protection symbols had become permanent marks, visible only when light struck at a certain angle. Michael, reviewing the photos on his camera, noticed something surprising. Each image seems to tell a different story now. It's as if the photographs had captured not just the moment, but also the emotions and energies present. The images on his camera had transformed into something more than simple records. Each photo seemed to have a life of its own, revealing layers of reality that human eyes normally couldn't perceive. In some, it was possible to clearly see the forms of the guardians. In others, the lines of energy connecting Duke and Ethan shone like golden threads. Ethan's special vision, Albert explained, is not a limitation as many might think. It's a gift that allows him to see beyond appearances, to see the true essence of things and beings that surround him. The last luminous entities began to say goodbye, their forms dissolving gently in the dawn light. Each of them gently touched Duke and Ethan one last time, leaving a trail of energy that integrated into the protection field that now permanently enveloped them. Sarah realized that silent tears were running down her face. They weren't tears of worry or fear, but of deep gratitude and understanding. Her son wasn't just protected. He was part of something greater, something sacred that transcended common understanding. Duke approached her, gently touching her hand with his muzzle. His eyes, still carrying that inner glow, conveyed a clear message. He had always been destined to be more than a simple pet. He was an ancestral guardian who had chosen to return in physical form to fulfill his sacred mission of protecting and guiding Ethan. The sun continued its ascent in the sky, its rays now painting the garden with natural colors that blended harmoniously with the last vestiges of the supernatural event they had witnessed. It was the beginning of a new phase, where the extraordinary and the everyday would intertwine in ways that only Ethan, with his special vision, and Duke, with his ancestral wisdom, could truly understand. A week had passed since the great encounter, and life in the house seemed to have found a new rhythm. The marks of the extraordinary event remained visible in subtle ways. The protection symbols on the walls now glowed softly during twilight, and Duke maintained that slight golden radiance in his fur, visible only at certain times of the day. Sarah was organizing the photos Michael had taken during the ritual when she noticed something extraordinary. Each image seemed to change slightly every time it was observed, revealing new details and layers of energy that hadn't been perceived before. "It's incredible," she said, showing the photos to Albert, who had become a close friend of the family. "It's as if each photo were a portal to that night." Albert smiled, leafing through his own set of notes that he had begun to make since the event. Mrs. Anderson was right about everything. These photographs are more than simple records. They're living memories of a sacred moment. Duke, lying near Ethan's crib as always, raised his head upon hearing his name mentioned. His eyes, which still maintained that special glow acquired during the ritual, focused on Ethan with an intensity that conveyed all the love and protection of his ancestral soul. "Observe," Albert whispered, pointing to the scene. Small spheres of light, almost imperceptible in daylight, danced around Ethan as he slept. It was as if the guardians had left a part of their essence permanently connected to the baby, creating a constant protection field that only Duke could fully supervise. Michael, who had installed special cameras to record any supernatural manifestation, showed the recordings from the past week. The images revealed a fascinating pattern. Every night, exactly at midnight, Ethan's room would fill with a soft light, while Duke performed a kind of silent ritual, reinforcing the protections established during the great encounter. "Each guardian has their own way of maintaining the protections," Albert explained, consulting the old notes. Duke chose to remain in physical form, not only to protect Ethan, but to serve as a permanent bridge between our world and the realm of the Guardians. Sarah approached the crib, watching her son sleep peacefully. Ethan had changed since the ritual, not physically, but there was a serenity in his countenance, as if he were finally in complete harmony with the special gifts he possessed. True vision, Albert said softly, doesn't depend on physical eyes. Ethan can see things that most of us will never be able to perceive, and Duke is his guide on this unique journey. The Pitbull calmly stood up, approaching Sarah. His fur momentarily shone with that golden light when she caressed him, as if responding to the touch with his own form of affection. It was a constant reminder of his true nature, an ancestral being who had chosen to return in canine form to fulfill a sacred mission. "You know," Michael commented, embracing Sarah as they watched Duke return to his post beside the crib, "when we adopted Duke, we never imagined he would be much more than a pet. He truly is a guardian angel." Duke turned his gaze to them, and at that moment it was possible to see all the wisdom of his previous lives reflected in his eyes. He wasn't just a protector, he was a mentor, a guide who would help Ethan navigate between the visible and invisible worlds, teaching him to use his special gifts to bring more light to the world. The curtains of the room moved softly with a non-existent breeze, and for a moment it was possible to see the ethereal silhouettes of the guardians dancing in the air. It was a gentle reminder that the magic they had witnessed had not ended. It had only transformed into something more subtle, more integrated into their daily lives. Duke raised his head, his eyes shining with that special inner light, as if responding to a call that only he could hear. Ethan, still sleeping, smiled in his sleep, his little hands moving as if playing with lights that only he could fully see. At that moment, they all understood that their story was part of something much greater, an ancient tapestry of love, protection, and magic that would continue to be woven through the ages, connecting guardians and their charges in an eternal dance of light and unconditional love. As the days passed, Sarah and Michael began to notice subtle changes in their everyday life. The house seemed to have a warm, protective aura that was especially noticeable during twilight hours. Plants in the garden grew more vibrantly, and there was a sense of peace that enveloped anyone who entered their home. Ethan's development was remarkable. Though still unable to see in the conventional sense, his other senses seemed heightened. He responded to sounds and touches with an awareness that seemed beyond his years. His laughter, always joyful, now seemed to carry a hint of something otherworldly, as if he was privy to delightful secrets only he could perceive. Duke's behavior, too, continued to evolve. While he remained the vigilant protector, there was now an added dimension to his interactions with Ethan. Sometimes Sarah would catch them in what appeared to be silent communication, Ethan giggling and reaching out, while Duke sat perfectly still, his eyes glowing with that inner light. Albert became a regular visitor, always eager to document new developments and cross-reference them with Mrs. Anderson's notes. "What we're witnessing," he would often say, "is the unfolding of an ancient prophecy. Ethan and Duke are part of a lineage that stretches back through time, guardians and charges working together to maintain the balance between worlds." One evening, as the family sat in the living room with Ethan playing on a blanket and Duke nearby, something extraordinary happened. A soft, melodious hum filled the air, seeming to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. Ethan stopped his play, his face turned upward with a look of pure joy. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, afraid to break the spell. Michael nodded, his eyes wide. "It's beautiful. But where is it coming from?" Albert, who had been reviewing some notes, looked up with a smile. "It's the Song of the Guardians," he said softly. "Mrs. Anderson mentioned it, but I never thought I'd actually hear it. It's said to be audible only in homes where the bond between guardian and charge is exceptionally strong." As they listened, mesmerized, Duke gently nuzzled Ethan, and the baby's laughter joined the ethereal melody, creating a harmony that seemed to make the very air shimmer with joy.